In this video, I'm going to walk you through step by step on how to build a PC and how to install Windows after you've completed the build. The first thing we need to do is look at what components you will need. There's the case, the CPU cooler, the compatible motherboard, RAM, a graphics card, a power supply, case fans, lighting strips, and fun accessories to make your computer look better. And that's a quick look at everything you will need. Now let's get started by preparing the case. What I like to do when I get a new case is just kind of look at it to see what we're working with. Here we have a front tempered glass panel, which is really sleek looking. In the back we can see our input-output ports and where our power supply should go. The back side of the case merely has some mesh for air intake, while the top of the case has an on-off button, a USB port, a USB-C port, and an audio jack. Now that we open it up, we can see a few of the front panel connectors, which will later go into the motherboard. Let's go ahead and remove that tempered glass panel. Make sure you keep track of the screws. In this particular case, there's a shelf for hard drives. I will not be using your typical hard disk drive, so I will be removing it. If you intend to, go ahead and leave it in. These 4 screws hold it in place. Let's install some case fans. Here are some of my favorite fans, along with some anti-vibration fan mounts. This case has a removable plate for easy install fans. This can also make it easier for radiator placement in the case of water cooling. Now it's time to screw the fans on the plate. Make sure you pay attention to the arrows that will tell you which way the fan blows air. Exhaust fans are generally in the back, while intake fans are generally in the front. These fans originally come in gray, but I painted them to match my color scheme. I am also using these anti-vibration fan mounts, which are little rubber pieces that prevent the fan from rattling against the metal. Make sure you line up the fan to where you want it. The screws you will use are the threaded ones that usually come with the fan. Now it's time to put the plate back in along with the fans. Watch out for the fan cords, and make sure that they are able to run through the back of the case so they can reach the motherboard later. Now we go on to installing other components onto the motherboard. I'm using a Gigabyte motherboard with an NH-D15 air cooler, which will be making sure my 10th gen i7 is kept cool. I have 32 gigabytes of basic Corsair RAM and a Samsung M.2 drive. We open up the motherboard box to find the motherboard covered in a plastic shroud. There is also the manual, which is useful for when installing the front connectors, M.2 drives, and fans. We also find a CD which is full of very important drivers that you'll need to install later. It comes with a couple SATA cables, which will be used if you use an SSD or a regular hard drive. My M.2 does not require one. This is a connector to help install the front panel connectors. This is the first one I've seen and will make installing the connectors much easier. Now we're on to installing the CPU. We need to remove this plastic cover. To do so, just unlock the little handle and pull it up. We finally get to take out the CPU. Be careful when handling the processor. Try and avoid getting any skin oils on it. Now line up the slots in the processor with the slots on the motherboard socket. Once you make sure the processor is in correctly, it is time to seat it. This will require pushing the handle back down and locking it back into place. It requires a little force, but not too much. Next, we install the RAM onto the motherboard. The stick of RAM will have a little notch in it, which will fit only one way into the motherboard slot. Make sure all the little tabs are pushed back. If you are only using 2 sticks of RAM, confront your motherboard manual to see which 2 slots the RAM sticks go into. Once the RAM is in place, just push down one side to hear a pop, and then push down the other side to hear another little pop, and then you know the RAM is correctly installed. The next thing we are going to do is install the M.2 drive. First, you will want to consult your manual to make sure you are putting the M.2 drive in the correct spot. Each M.2 port restricts a different SATA port, so make sure you are aware of which SATA ports are still available if installing other hard drives. This motherboard has an M.2 heat shield. Some boards may or may not have this. Remove the little screws and make sure that you fully push the M.2 drive into the port. It should feel securely seated. Then go ahead and replace the screws. Next up is installing the CPU cooler. In my case, I will be using an air cooler. In fact, one of the biggest ones you can buy. Most coolers come with different instructions for different chipsets. Choose the instructions that fit your socket. In this case, I'm using the new 10th gen Intel 1200 socket. Consult the instructions for exactly what parts are needed for your socket. You will want to remove the fan for installation purposes. First, you want to attach the appropriate mount for your socket. This may include a backplate and a couple bolts. Before you attach any CPU cooler, you should always add some thermal paste. Sometimes thermal paste is included on the bottom of your CPU cooler. In this case it is not, so we use a special thermal paste. You only want a very small amount, about the size of a pea. Too much thermal paste or too little will cause heating problems later on. No need to spread it out. When you attach the cooler, it will do the job for you. Now we can attach the heatsink to the mount we put in earlier. These screws are usually spring-loaded, so sometimes it requires a little force to get them to screw down. This cooler came with a black fan, but I painted mine to match the overall theme. Once the fan is installed on the heatsink, attach the 4-pin fan connector to the CPU fan header on your motherboard. This way, the motherboard will regulate the fan speed based on the CPU temperature. This CPU has optional heatsink coverings you can buy for aesthetic purposes. I am using them to add a bit more color to my build. Now we get to put the motherboard inside of the case. Make sure these standoff screws are installed. This prevents the motherboard from coming in contact with the metal of the case, which can short circuit your PC. This case already has them installed for a standard ATX size motherboard. Here you can see where the standoff screws line up with the motherboard itself. Before you put the motherboard in, make sure this I/O shield is installed in your case. This board comes with the shield already attached, so it's one less thing to worry about. Notice I add those 2 exhaust fans before I put in the motherboard. This was a mistake and I later had to take them out so it would fit. Once the standoff screws line up with the motherboard holes, go ahead and screw them in. Your motherboard will usually come with the appropriate screw for this job. Now it's time to plug in the front panel connectors for the case. This case is a USB 3.2 and a USB-C port. I used the motherboard manual to find where the connectors were. The blue tipped one is going to be the USB 3.2, while the smaller one is going to be for the USB-C port. The cord that says HD audio is going to be for the audio jack on top of your case. The connector for that is usually found on the left bottom side of your motherboard. Now it's time to connect those small 1-pin front panel connectors. This motherboard came with an additional connector to make installing it much easier. Now we're moving on to installing the power supply and the power cables. This is a fully modular power supply, which means you can pick and choose which cables you actually want attached. The first power cable we need is the motherboard cable. Make sure you attach the side that says PSU to the power supply. Some motherboards have an additional spot for another 6 and 4 pin cord. If that's the case, use the additional CPU port on your power supply. My GPU requires an 8 and 6 pin power cord, so we will add an 8 and 6 pin cord to the VGA slot on the power supply. If you are using an SSD or hard drive, you will need an additional SATA power cord. I'm not, but I may want to add one later, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in anyway. Now we can put in the power supply. Make sure it's fan side down. Then go ahead and use the 4 screws to lock it in place. It's time to do some cable management. We just added all these cords, so it's going to look like a rat's nest. We can use some zip ties and Velcro straps to help tie up some loose cords and tie them down to the case. I am also using cables with cable combs to continue to match my theme. You can get either a full cable kit or just cable extensions if you want to add some color to your build. Now we can plug our motherboard cable into the 24 pin slot. You can also add your other CPU cables. In this case, I had to remove the fan for mine to fit. During this time, you can also plug in your 3 or 4 pin fan connectors into the system fan spots on your motherboard. Now we get to install your LED light strips. This is an optional step, but one commonly used. The strips will come with either magnets or adhesive tape on the back, so you can attach them out of sight. Newer motherboards will already have a spot for light strips. Plug in either your 3 or 4 pin connectors. Once again, make sure all your fans are plugged into your motherboard. One of the last steps is installing the graphics card. Take the slots out of the case that line up with your graphics card. This is where the display outputs will be shown. Press down the little tab on the PCIe slot. This is where your graphics card will slide into. You will hear a click when the graphics card has been seated properly. Now just plug it in and screw it in on the side. Once you replace the back panel and the front panel, we will have successfully turned this group of parts into this beautiful PC. Lastly, it's time to install Windows. When you buy a Windows CD, you'll get something that looks like this. Insert the disk into a CD drive and turn on your PC. Hopefully, you get your motherboard loading screen and then the BIOS should pop up. Here we can check to make sure we installed our drives right. If you see them, that means they have been installed correctly. Next, you want to find your boot sequence menu and make sure that the Windows 10 installation disk is at the very top. Once that's the case, go ahead and save and exit the BIOS and then restart your PC. The Windows 10 installation screen should now load up. Once you select Install, you will need to enter your Windows product key. You'll then want to select Custom Installation and install Windows 10 to the drive you want it on. Now you just wait for it to finish installing. Once Windows is installed, you will install the graphics card and motherboard drivers. After that, you're all set. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. Any suggestions on future videos are greatly appreciated.